I hope everybody can hear me. Sorry for we've had some little technical snafus here because we have a new audiovisual system in the Suda Symposium. It's going to be in the seminar room. It's going to be great, but we're still kind of figuring out some of the details. Anyway, thanks for joining us at this Bench2Market talk today. And I think we want to go back on the slides. Now, there we go. Yep. This is the Bench2Market seminar series is hosted by Biolocity, the Georgia Tech Petit Institute for Bioengineering and Bioscience, and that's where we are today, and also the Georgia CTSA. Today, we are going to hear about investment in dilution, business strategies for equity negotiation. But I also wanted to let everybody know about some upcoming events, just so that you're aware and put on your calendar. On February 2nd, we're going to have a Bio Launchpad seminar on IndieBio, New York. It's going to be an info session. And this should be very interesting to those folks that are interested in, that have some technologies that are ready to spin out. IndieBio New York is a startup accelerator. They do fund startup companies, also provide guidance, also, wet lab space. And so we'll be hearing more about that program. And the next Bench2Market talk will be on FDA regulatory strategy on February 15th. So again, just put that on your calendar. Today's talk again about investment and dilution. This is James Stubbs, Dr. James Stubbs, who is a professor of the practice in Georgia Tech's BME department, and also a serial entrepreneur, is going to be giving the seminar today. This is a really great seminar he's given in the past, so we really love having him back. And without any further ado, I'm going to like to introduce Dr. Stubbs.
Well, thank you very much. So hopefully everybody can hear me okay. So I'm going to be having to work the slides the old-fashioned way with the keyboard, but that's okay. And I'm going to try to stand out of the light a little bit. But anyway, as Dr. Sundell said, I am a serial killer. I mean, an entrepreneur. And that always, sometimes that really does sound bad. But what we're going to talk about today is financing and dilution in startup companies. And just so that you know exactly where I'm coming from, I'm going to do a little bit of an intro about me. So please bear with me. So I'm a professor of the practice. That just means I spent most of my career in industry doing that kind of stuff. I do have a Ph.D. in nuclear engineering, but I've worked mainly in the radioactive drug space, medical device space, radiation therapy, surgery, and things of that nature. I'm currently on the boards of two different privately held medical device companies. We've actually raised, those two companies have raised somewhere around $50 million in the last few years. And so I have a little bit of experience talking about that kind of thing. The very first medical device company I did was Proxima Therapeutics, and we did two different products, and we took them from the ideas on a napkin from a neurosurgeon all the way up to building, getting FDA clearance for two different products that were balloon catheters that delivered radiation therapy to brain tumors and breast cancer. And we took that all the way through the FDA, built two sales forces, and ultimately sold it to a public company, Cytech Surgical Products. That was the first one. So I went from the startup having multiple roles there. I stayed with the acquirer, so I got experience with the big companies. And I will tell you, like you'll see in a slide in a couple of minutes, I really like the small companies a lot better. So Cytech acquired us, and after about 18 months of working there, they came in and fired all of us. They had acquired, Cytech did pap smears. They had 80% of the pap smear device market. And they bought an endometrial ablation device company, and then they bought Proxima, pulled them together, put them in Palo Alto in Class A office space, which none of us were used to, and then decided we really don't like the way your culture is, because they were from Boston. We were from the Bay Area. Didn't work. So they fired us all. And that was like horrible, right? No. 2 days later, I started Focal Therapeutics. And this was a company where we made a bioabsorbable implant that was put into lumpectomy cavities that took up the space that the tumor removal had caused a volume defect for the patient. And it also provided radiopaque markers so that radiation therapists would know where to target. And it allowed us, the two or three devices I've done in the breast space, allowed radiation therapy to go from 5 weeks of once-a-day treatment to 5 days. You could get it done that fast. It was really nice. I also worked as a chief science officer at Sienna Medical. We were also in the breast space. We did it was like a radar type of localization to replace wire localization with just implanting a tiny little seed. And then the surgeon could use a little magic wand and tunnel down to the exact location the tumor was. This was a really nice benefit for the women who were having to go from having, to do an open lumpectomy. It really made things much more convenient for them and for the surgeons. I also, let's see, Sienna and Focal, they've all been acquired. Andari Therapeutics was going to be a class 3 medical device. It was an implantable neurostimulator for overactive bladder. Those things are really hard. They take like 150 million in venture capital and so forth. We ultimately found out there was no possible way this company was going to work. So I shut it down before I spent more than just 50,000 of my own money. I didn't waste any investor money on that. But we found out that Botox actually takes care of the problem really, really well for a lot of reasons. But so I shut that down. So I've experienced a lot of different things, both from companies that were successful, we sold them, to one that just total face plant, never got anywhere. Then the last one, as I made the transition from operating roles into being an investor. So I started the life science vertical for the Atlanta Technology Angels back in 2013 or 2014. We made an investment, the first one ever that group had ever done in a medical device company, in OB Medical. Turns out that they had all kinds of problems getting this product to the market, getting it through the FDA. The board asked me to go figure out what the hell was going on with that, and I did. When I found out, I fired the CEO, the COO, demoted the CFO, and basically ran it for 6 months until I could find somebody who would come in and do it. We revamped the product. We got it done in the proper fashion for a medical device, and ultimately Philips acquired that company. So out of all these, Proxima was acquired, Focal, Sienna, 3 of them are acquired within 30 days of each other in 2018. That was a nice Christmas that year. So that was fun. But these are some of the products that I developed. The first one, this is a neuro-oncology product. So what you're seeing up there is a balloon catheter system that would be inflated with radioactive fluid. The fluid was not designed to come out of the balloon catheter, just the soft X-ray radiation that it emitted did. And that irradiated the surgical margin, which is where the residual tumor cells are left after removing a glioma. And here you can see it being put into a resected brain tumor cavity. And you can also see then the catheter underneath the skin. And then here's a shot over on the left. That's an MRI of a tumor. And then post-surgically, you can see it's nice and round in that location. That's the balloon catheter actually in the patient's brain. This was an adaptation of that catheter system for breast cancer patients. So that's a CT scan of one of our balloon catheters filling a lumpectomy cavity. A radiation source on a wire would go down to the middle of that device and gently irradiate the residual tissue around it. It gets you a lot better cosmetic outcomes because you didn't irradiate the whole breast and cause a lot of contracture and asymmetry and other issues like that. And it'll let you get it done in 5 days instead of 5 weeks. This is Focal Therapeutics device. It looks like a spring. All of the clear part is a bioabsorbable polymer that dissolves over the course of like 12 months or so. It takes up the space that the lumpectomy generated, and it has 6 titanium markers embedded in it. That allowed the tumor site to be precisely located, and so that we could do subsequent radiation therapy and follow-up mammograms, which you can see down below. There's a couple of different mammograms of the device in place. This was a really fun project. This one took 11 years from concept to acquisition. So Proxima took 8, that one took 11. It's not getting any easier out there. The 2 different companies I'm on the boards of, one of them is Oxos Medical. They're actually here in Midtown, and it's a digital radiography company. We actually have a wireless X-ray generator that you can do up to like fluoroscopy with this, along with the flat panel on the back side of the patient that acquires the X-rays and generates the images. The other company is really fascinating is Restored, and they do both custom 3D printed metal and polymer implants for patients. And we've actually replaced an entire half of a hip or a pelvis on a patient with osteosarcoma with that type of technology. That company is almost fully vertically integrated. They make everything themselves. They do everything except for the sterilization of the final product. And for those of you who in the room and online that are from tech or have ties to tech, 52 engineers work at Restored, and probably a third of them came from here. So it's really exciting to see our graduates go to work in some place really cool. Now, you've got a little bit about my background. I'm going to give you some squishier stuff. I love being an entrepreneur. I love being in a small group where you could always see whether or not you were contributing positively or negatively or not. That's something that in big companies, it can be very, very difficult. So I was very comfortable with that. I love bringing new products to market. When I talk about the brain tumor device, I oftentimes will get chills and the hair on my arm will stand up because I saw the first 21 people who got this device put in their brain and get radiation therapy with it. And it's just a wonderful feeling to know you're doing, sorry about that, doing things like really good things for people. I hated fundraising. I hated it. This is not fun. So if you're able to do it in early stage CEOs, this is almost your full-time job for years. Not so much managing the company, but managing the finances. So I didn't like this. I am totally open to working with startups, not for money, not stuff like that, just talking to you about the problems you face and the ways maybe I've seen that work and don't work on it. This is something I didn't know you could just ask people for help and they would actually give it to you. That was like a mind-blowing thing for me. And that's one of the things I want to offer you, that if you want to contact me, stubbs@godtech.edu, that's my email. I'd be happy to jump on a call and talk about anything that's bugging you. The other thing I just wanted to mention, and this is a firm belief of mine, and I'm glad everybody in here is sort of in the entrepreneurial role, we create value in the world. That's one of our unique little superpowers, is when you do this right, you're solving problems. And when you solve somebody's problems, your product will get adopted. And that's what this is all about, particularly in healthcare. So with all of that, we're now going to jump into a whole range of things. We're going to start off real quickly reviewing the different corporate structures, and then we're talking about the pros and cons of those. Then we'll move into financing, and I'll give you a concrete example of what happens to your ownership of your startup as you start bringing money in from investors. That's usually pretty shocking at the end. So you got the limited liability corporation. This is how oftentimes you'll get your first start. Investors can't go into this because it's not the right corporate structure. So this is a fine way to get started because it's very inexpensive to set up, and administratively it's very easy to deal with. But as soon as you take investor money, they're going to require you to be a different corporate structure. But it's not the S Corp. S Corp is also what they call a pass-through entity. That's what you would do if you're a consultant and you had a side hustle and you were helping out a pharma company or something like that with something. That's what you would want to do as a C Corp. An S Corp. The third one is the C Corp. This is what every public company that's out there, and every investor-backed company is a C Corp. In fact, they're usually a Delaware C Corp. But this is the type of form that investors require because it has a number of different features on here. And I think I hit that in the next slide, but investors, they expect to make multiples on their money. So like an angel investor who puts money, the first money into your company, they may explicitly tell you, but they're probably not going to. They're expecting a 20x return on their money, if not more. I would tell you also they're diluting themselves. But let them have their delusion, but this is where you typically get your first money if it's not non-dilutive sources, which we will hit that too. All right, so for the C Corp, here's the interesting things about it. You can have an unlimited number and type of shareholder. With an S Corp, you can't have more than, I think, 500 shareholders in that corporate structure, and you typically don't. With a C Corp, you can have millions of shareholders. Like Tesla, for example, is a C Corp, and it's a Delaware C Corp. So you can have multiple, you can have hundreds and thousands or millions of investors, and you have different share classes. So with public companies, they pretty much only have common stock out there. When you're in the privately held part of the world, like doing venture financing for your startup, you're going to have common stock that the founders of the company have, and your employees will get in terms of founder shares or stock options, but you have preferred share classes. That's where the investors come in. And preferred shares have added rights and privileges that the common shareholders don't get, and they get paid first before the common stockholders actually get paid when you get acquired or if you were to go into a bankruptcy situation. There's also this little thing called QSB, a qualified small business. This is a beautiful thing for you founders out there, because if you start a company and you own quite a bit of the common stock in it, if you hold it for 5 years before you liquidate it, before you sell it to big XYZ Incorporated, you pay 0 federal income tax, 0 capital gains tax. This is awesome. And that rule went into play sometime around 2015 or 16. So half of my shares in Focal Therapeutics, which I started in 2008, were subject to QSB. So I didn't pay any tax on that. Some of them were older than that before the law went into effect, and I had to pay 23, 24% tax. Even though it was long-term capital gains, I had to pay the 20% capital gains tax plus that 3.8% additional the ACA surcharge that when Obamacare went into play, there was an additional surcharge on capital gains that they put in. Cindy, qualified small business. Okay. Venture funds, VCs, they cannot invest in pass-through entities. That's why it's always going to be a C Corp that they invest in. They're almost certainly going to make sure you're a Delaware C Corp, because the Delaware corporate law is the friendliest to business. So that's where almost all of them go. One of the things to be careful of is if you do start a Delaware C Corp, and the first time I did one of these and I was told by the state of Delaware, oh, you need to file your tax return. Your tax is going to be, it was like $17 million. I was like, how in the, company didn't make any money yet. We hadn't done anything yet. That was one way that they structure it based on the number of shares that are issued. But then there's an alternate way you can do a tax return in Delaware, which is on the way you would normally do it. How much revenue, how much expenses, were you profitable or not? When I converted it over, I ended up paying like $235 fee. And that was it. But I think they do this on purpose, and they get 1 or 2 people every year and just rip the hell out of them. It's not pretty. Disadvantages, there's really none to talk about. You will not do the tax return for a C Corp. No, you need a CPA to do it. You could, in theory, do like an LLC, but boy, you'd have to be a glutton for punishment to really get into it. So not really too many disadvantages. But when we start looking at where do you get cash for your venture, and why do you need it, and how much do you need? And it's really going to depend on the stage of your venture and exactly what you're doing. So I'm going to really just concentrate on healthcare type technologies, primarily medical devices. Pharma is a little bit different because their pathway is almost always the same. You're going to do preclinical work. You're going to then go into what do they call it? A phase 1, then a phase 2, then you're going to do your big phase 3 study. In medical devices, we may not have to do any clinical studies at all, or we may have to do a first-in-man study, or we might have to do a proof of principle type of thing in 30 or 40 patients. I had to do that with Proxima Therapeutics on both of our technologies, 21 patients and 45 patients. That's pretty simple. You're doing class 3 medical device, you're going to be doing a pivotal trial. That's what they call it. It's just like a phase 3 clinical trial. You have hypotheses about how effective it's going to be against the standard of care. And those are really expensive and a lot of patients in it. And that's one of the reasons why most of us don't like to do class 3 medical devices as a startup. So that's really going to, what you're choosing, if you're choosing class 1, class 2, class 3, that's going to ultimately dictate probably how much money you're going to have to raise and who you're going to raise it from. If you do a class 3 medical device, you're going to raise a lot of venture money, but you're going to get strategics like Johnson & Johnson or Medtronic or Boston Scientific. Or if you look at companies like CardioMEMS, does anybody remember CardioMEMS? Which was right over there in Technology Enterprise Park. Well, they had multiple strategic investors. St. Jude was one of them, which I think ultimately became Abbott, right? And I can't remember who else, but they put in $30–40 million, and they got special rights. In addition to getting stock, they got rights of, they get the first right to acquire the company upon PMA, getting the PMA, things like that. And it just takes so much money to do those class 3 devices. That's why you end up having to get money from more than just venture capitalists. The amount of money you need also depends on how you plan on launching your product once you have permission to market it. The only way I've had success has been direct sales force. That is really expensive because you're hiring those people and putting them out to sell. Target compensation for a direct sales rep right now is probably about minimum $300,000 a year. And you want to pay them more like $500,000 because that means they're very, very effective and you're writing big fat commission checks. It's the only commission check is the only check that my CFOs have ever liked to write. But that's why it's so expensive. You have to probably raise an extra $15–20 million to put on your own direct sales force in a startup. The other way to do it is to use distributors. The problem with using distributors, at least in my experience, has been you don't own the customer anymore. You've got no insight into how the customer's perceiving your product. And you also have no control over how aggressively they sell your product. You have to make it the most lucrative product they carry in order for them to actually take it out and actively try to sell it. Because if Medtronic's product is more lucrative to them, that's the only thing they're going to pull out in a sales call. But they can be effective if you know how to use them and you structure those deals correctly. You can also sometimes, like a class 3 medical device, you can get a strategic partner like at Proxima Therapeutics. We had a company called Biopsis Medical that was in the breast biopsy space. They put in money on our Series C, and what they demanded out of us, in addition to stock, was distribution rights. And it made sense for us to do that because they were in the exact call point we wanted to be in. So that made a lot of sense. Within a year of them putting that money into us, they got acquired by Ethicon Endosurgery, and the deal wasn't lucrative enough of a distributorship for Ethicon. They gave us back the sales rights. So we built our own sales force for that one. So we actually did it both ways on that one. Then in terms of financing, there's really two broadly, there's two kinds, non-dilutive and dilutive. Dilutive is the equity financing. We're going to show you a couple of real concrete examples of what happens when you go the dilutive or equity financing route. Here in Georgia, and I know some of you online are here in Georgia, some of you are not. So I can only speak to Georgia. There's a lot of non-dilutive financing that's available here. And there's some of it is, you've heard of the friends, families, and fools. Well, I didn't put that on the slide, but that's oftentimes what it is. Be a little careful with selling, taking investment money from people that are in your family and in your friend circle, because more than likely, they're not going to get it back. Hate to be that way. There's state level grants. Georgia Research Alliance is one of them. They've got all kinds of programs with different phase 1, phase 2 grants, and then they've got some venture debt you can get on top of that. And there's a number of Georgia Tech spinouts that have actually been very successful with that. That one, I think, has a caveat. You have to have IP coming out of the University System of Georgia. But you can also look over at ATDC. They've got all kinds of programs and people they can point you to over there, including the SBIR, which is a Small Business Innovative Research Grant. Those things, this is just like free money. And any federal agency, NIH, NSF, Department of Agriculture, anybody who gets over a certain amount of federal funding, they have to establish an SBIR program. So we will oftentimes file for phase 1, phase 2 grants. The phase 1, I think, will go up to $250,000 now. And phase 2, I've seen well in excess of $1.5 million on that. This is beautiful money, totally free. They don't take a single share of stock. This is awesome. And like most grants, the more of the work you're proposing to do in the grant that you have already completed, the better your application is received. It's just like an R01. exactly the same process. How those things work, that really is, that's a seminar unto itself. But there is Connie Castile at ATDC over in Tech Square. That's her job, and she's good at it. So if you have questions about that, go talk to her, and she can help you find a solicitation that your venture is responsive to, and then help you with the process of pulling together those apps. All right, has anybody ever heard of a convertible note? Good, good. Has anybody heard of the safe note? We're gonna talk about both of those. So a convertible note is actually a debt instrument, which just means somebody's loaning you money. But the funny thing is, yes, they're loaning it to you, but they do not want it back with the interest on it. They want it to convert into equity. That's why they call it a convertible note. So typical interest rates today are like 8 to 10%. You typically put a cap on it, and a cap's kind of a complicated thing to talk about, but it's basically saying if you put a cap on a convertible note at an early stage startup of say $4 million, and you go and do a financing, and some investor says, I'll give you a pre-money value of $10 million. Well, you're going to end up giving twice the amount of stock to the convertible note person because you capped them at $4 million in value. This is a real big protection for those convertible note holders. It really stinks if you're the guy having to give twice as much, stock. But at the end of the day, that's usually a small amount of money, so it doesn't convert to a large amount of stock. So it's okay to set a cap like that. The problem with setting a low cap is the investor, who is usually a VC, who's going to go into it, will look at your cap and go, that's your pre-money value. And I'll walk through pre-money values in just a minute. This is not a good thing. And you should be able to have a cogent argument for why that cap should not be used as your pre-money valuation. And usually that's a fairly easy argument to make. You've made more progress. You're doing it to attract the investor. That investor is at higher risk than the new ones are. You can do that kind of stuff. And there's typically a discount on it. They don't come into play, but if you did do a financing at a $4 million pre-money value, they would actually get enough stock that it would be effectively, they had a pre-money value of 10% less than that, maybe 3.6 million. It means they get 10% more shares that way. It's a way for them to be compensated for having put money into your venture at a much earlier stage than the bigger money down the road. All right. The convertible note will accrue interest. So 6 months later, you do your qualified financing. If they gave you $25,000, it's probably going to be more like $26,500 at a 10% interest rate. That's what is going to convert. The principal and interest will both convert for them. And it converts into the type of stock that gets issued to the next financing. So if that's a Series A preferred that you do, those things will convert into Series A preferred shares. If it's for some reason you do something and it's common stock, then they'll get common stock instead. So typically when angel investors participate in your company, they're going to issue a convertible note. Some of them will do safe notes. Most of them like the convertible notes because they get interest and some other stuff with it. And it'll convert over to Series A and the debt gets wiped out. That has some accounting implications. All of a sudden you go from having short-term or long-term liabilities. Those go away. That's what a convertible note is. It's debt. It goes away as soon as it converts, and now it's on the equity side of your balance or on your balance sheet. So the debt is gone at that point. And these are small points, but they do come into play. Convertible notes can be very complicated to predict on your cap table, capitalization table, what the actual impact is because of the interest and the discounts and and the caps and all that kind of stuff. It can be very complicated. You oftentimes will need a professional, a CPA or somebody like that, to actually do those computations so that you understand what's happening to your company and the ownership of your company. Now, these are considered non-dilutive up until the point they convert. As soon as they convert, they are dilutive because stock gets issued to them at that point. So now you're getting some dilution. And I'll show you how this is impacted in the dilution example we do at the end. A safe note's different. SAFE stands for, let's see if I can get this right. It's a Simple agreement for future equity. And that's what it is. As soon as you take money on a safe note, that's equity. You've just put out equity. For example, I recently put $60,000 into a startup at a $6 million pre-money valuation. I own 1% of that company now. And that's just how that works. So it's really straightforward. And when you do this, it is so simple to see what happens to your cap table. You do need to be a little bit careful with some of these things, because if you take some really large amounts of money at a low valuation, you could end up wiping out 30, 40, 50% of your company in that initial transaction. And that's not very founder friendly, let's say. There are 3 different flavors of safe notes. This came out of the Y Combinator, and they actually have a thing that if you take their standard, one of those 3 standard safe notes, one with valuation cap, no discount, a discount, no valuation cap, and then most favored nation, no valuation cap, no discount. When you do those, they actually have a version that if anybody changes the language in those, it is obvious what got changed. It's almost like a red line type thing. And that's really important because it's still like a 3-page, 4-page legal document. And you need to understand if a term changes, some of those terms, when they change, have hideous implications for the founders. And that's what they were trying to avoid, is make this standardized across the early investor industry. These, by the way, are all hyperlinks. I'll make the slide deck available. You can go grab them anytime you want to if you just pick up the slide decks. Who would be the person that would distribute or have them available? Okay, make sure I get it to you. Cool, just shoot me an email, I'll send it to you. Great. All right, so the equity is issued at signing the note, not at the next financing. It happens right then. Again, it's simple on your cap table. So in general, here's what your rounds, and this is the terminology you're going to hear investors and entrepreneurs talk about. Pre-seed round. This used to be $250,000. You know, like this is the friends, families, and foundations and stuff like that. It used to be like 250,000 bucks. It can be as high as 2 million now. By the way, there's if any of you ever seen pitchbook.com, they put out reports quarterly about venture financing by different industries. And one of them is healthcare, one of them's pharma and biotech, and then there's fintech and a bunch of other stuff. And they'll break it down by the average deal size, the percentile deal size for all these different rounds, for all those different industries. And they'll give you all sorts of information that will help you have a sort of, here's the state of the industry in my area, which is really, really powerful when you're negotiating with an investor over what the economic terms of your deal should be. So that's a really good place to go. But they do talk about pre-seeds. Then you got seed rounds, which is typically your angels. It's getting into some bigger numbers. Some angel rounds now can go up as high as 5 million bucks. And the reason for that is Series A, which is your classic institutional investor, venture capitalists. Their funds are so big today, they can't do 5 million bucks. So I'm going to do a quick sidebar on the way VC funds work. They'll go out and they'll pull in a bunch of money from limited partners. And right now they're pulling in fund sizes, $300, $400, $800 million. And what they typically do is they're going to make out of that fund 10 to 15 company investments. They'll do half of their money will get invested just in like the first 3 to 4 years of the fund's life. And they keep the rest of that cash sitting back there as dry powder. And they've invested in the next rounds for all those companies, at least all the companies that make it to the next round. These venture funds are supposed to sunset in 10 years from the time they've initially closed. This has an implication for you as an entrepreneur, because if you take money from a fund that's 6 years old and you're not going to get liquid, you're not going to be at a point where you can sell your company in less than 4 years, that venture capitalist who will be on your board is going to start putting a tremendous amount of pressure on you guys to sell the company way before you've actually built as much value as you can. So pay attention to the fund, when it was born, how far it's gone. And when you got an $800 million fund, and they're only going to do, say, make the numbers easy, 20 investments, you can see right away, that's some big dollars. That's not Series A type dollars anymore. That's like a C, a B, C, or a D. And these A's, B's, and so forth, they just keep going on. It's like Proxima Therapeutics, my first company, we did 5 rounds. We did up to a Series E. And I'll show you a little example of what that looked like as well. And this just keeps going on until you have a liquidity event. And a liquidity event, most of the time we look at that, your first thought is, that doesn't sound good. Well, it is. That means you got liquid on your investment and what you put into it. This is usually a really good thing. You got acquired or you went public. In medical devices, almost none of us have gone public in 25 years or more. So we just get acquired by the big boys. And the key to it in medical devices is you're going to get your product developed, you're going to get it cleared by the FDA, you're going to start generating sales. And the minute you cross the cash flow break-even line, you're now a candidate to be picked up. Because a public company, their share price is usually predicated on earnings per share. If they acquire a company that has negative earnings, their stock price goes down. They will not make that decision. So that's kind of the dynamic in a very, very high level. The other liquidity event is bankruptcy. So when you take investor money, you really are, at that point, you're on the hook to put in 120% effort for it. And for those of you who are contemplating doing one of these and taking investor money and using this as your principal form of employment, is that company, please do not say, I'm going to pay myself like 20% of what the going rate is for a CTO or a CEO in this space, because the investor is going to look at that and go, you're going to be driving for Uber, or you're going to be renting out your house in Airbnb. I want you to pay yourself enough, maybe 25% less than the going rate, because you've got a bunch of equity that you're supposed to be dragging your value out of. Pay yourself well enough so that I don't have to worry about you having a side hustle. This was a mistake that I made, thinking, oh, they just want to see me spend all the money that comes in on the company development activities. No, they're concerned about the management team. That's their number one concern. They're less concerned with your product, more about you. So always remember that. That's a point in your guys' favor. All right. In equity financing, the very earliest ones are going to be angels. And again, they're going to come in on convertible notes because that's what they understand. And they think they can generate more leverage for themselves. They typically do small amounts. And this is going to be a real issue for you if you're trying to raise $5 million and you've got 30 angels who are going into this, and there's a lot of little monies here and there. This is really a logistics nightmare for you. And I'll touch on that in just a second. Crowdsourcing, there have been 1 or 2 companies that have done like Indiegogo or Kickstarter. The problem for us is a lot of these things require you to give a product to somebody in return for the money, right? You can't do that until the FDA clears your product. And what the hell are they going to do with a surgical device? Well, I won't go there. So with venture capital, they typically come in a little bit later, larger amounts of money. This is where we call it the Series A and so forth. Those are going to be the prime investors. Usually the first ones that come in, they may participate some in Series B and Series C, but they're not going to lead those rounds. They're going to require a different lead venture capitalist to come in and lead those rounds. And that's probably a smart thing. All right, initial coin offerings and SPACs. You guys may not have heard of ICOs, right? It was a flash in the pan. It came when people were starting companies and they were basically raising it in Bitcoin or Ethereum and stuff like that. It's like, to me, that's a whack-doodle idea. I will speak my mind this morning. SPACs were super popular over the last 18 months. And I think people finally figured out they were oversold and they weren't exactly what they needed to be. If you had a good enough idea to warrant institutional investors, venture capitalists, legit people to come in and put money in your company, that was a much better way to do it than some private equity firm having raised $200 million or something like that and do basically a reverse initial public offering by merging you with this public SPAC company, special purpose acquisition company. That's what a SPAC is. That stuff is almost totally dried up at this point, and I think that's a good thing. So now we're going to get into some of the terminology. Pre-money valuation. This is just what your company's valued at before you take investor money. So anybody care to guess how you derive a pre-money value for your company? Go ahead and say it out loud. Anybody? Bingo. It's like pluck from air. Totally. Probably 10 years ago, the typical pre-money value for a seed round in medical devices, healthcare in Atlanta was $2.5 million. It didn't matter how good you were, how experienced the entrepreneur, it was always $2.5 million. If you took that same startup and said, I'm going to move to Palo Alto, it'd be 6 million. And it's just because the investors here were super conservative and didn't like that kind of stuff. Out in Silicon Valley, they're kind of like, who cares? They had plenty of money, so they would throw it around with some really silly pre-money values. So if you have a pre-money value of, say, $4 million, you raise $1 million from angels or whoever, you now have a post-money value of $5 million. And those investors just acquired 20% of the company. 1 million out of the 5 million is 20%, at least it was last time I did the math. So the angels now have 20% of your company. You just dropped from maybe, like when I started Focal Therapeutics, I owned 100% of the company. So in this case, all of a sudden, I'd only own 80% of the company. But when I owned 100%, its value was $0. Now it at least has a perceived value of $5 million. It really doesn't have a $5 million value. You can't sell it for $5 million. It's kind of strange, but some of the other things to watch out for is liquidation preference. And this is a special right that investors ask for or demand, depending on who's got the leverage in the negotiations. But typically liquidation preference is a VC will come in and say, I'm going to put in $5 million and I'm going to do 1x liquidation preference. That means the first $5 million that comes in under a company acquisition, they get. And then everything that's left gets distributed to the lower ranked shareholders, mainly the common stockholders. So if they put in 5 million with a 1x and you sell the company for 6 million, there's only $1 million that's going to the common shareholders. That's you guys. That stinks. What would be worse is if they had a 2x liquidation preference, in which case they get twice what they put in. You get nothing under that prior example. So this is one of the things to watch out for. 1x liquidation preferences are the going rate right now. When things get really bad in the economy, like back in like 2008, 2009, and the last big cratering we had, we started seeing 2x's, 3x's, and stuff like that. Then they also put in something that was really obnoxious, participating preferred. What this means is they got their liquidation preference and then they converted to common stock with the rest of you guys. And then everything that was left was distributed pro rata over both of you guys. This is horrible. If you can avoid this, fight tooth and nail to get rid of it because it is so employee and founder horrific. Just don't go there. All right. What's better is if it's just non-participating preferred. And what ends up happening there is, let's say they put in $5 million and you got a total of 10 million shares. If somebody comes in and says, I'll buy you for $100 million. Well, the VCs are not going to take 5 million and leave 95 million for the founders. What they'll do is they'll immediately convert to common stock. And then that full 100 million gets distributed pro rata over everybody. This is a beautiful outcome. That's what you want to have happen, is the acquisition price is big enough, everybody converts and nobody argues about it. So that's great. So angels are typically very wealthy people and they usually come in first. They put in small amounts, but they expect outsized levels of ownership for their small amount of money. So whatever you would end up raising on an angel round, they're really going to expect 15% to a third of the company in return for that. Maybe not one individual, but that entire angel class is going to be expecting that. They're also going to ask for a board seat. Angel investors, unless they're coming from operating experience in your field, or they have a Rolodex of really high net worth people, They're not bringing anything of value to your board. So try really hard not to let them on. You can give them observer status, or you can sunset them. You can say, okay, you can be on the board until we do the next round of financing, in which time you're rotating off, and we'll send you the board documents. You can, participate on a Zoom call with us. That usually will take care of it. The timeline for angels to get their return on investment is today, in my space, it's like 10 years or more. So that's why they're expecting a 20x, 25x type of return on their money. They never lead around. They don't know how to put a value on a startup. They just don't. They don't have the amount of experience. Like a VC might look at 1,000 different investment opportunities every year and only invest in 10, 15. This is what they do for a living. So they're usually pretty good at putting a value. The angels aren't. They'll use safe notes. Angels use safe notes and convertible notes, but they prefer the convertible notes. And they'll oftentimes try to syndicate their investment into multiple, with multiple groups. Like when we did OB Medical at Atlanta Technology Angels, we pulled in the AIM group from Alabama and two groups from South Carolina. And we pooled all of our investment to get it up to a size that we were able to demand a board seat. And the company is probably happy that ended up happening, because that was the company that had to be turned around. But that will often happen. The other thing that you can do with these small individual investors, and I've done this multiple times, is you pool them together into an LLC for investment. So you can take, let's say 20 investors at $2,000 each, you pool them all into one LLC, and then now you've got one shareholder on your cap table instead of 20. This makes managing shareholder approval activities super easy, because you don't have to contact 20 people. You can contact the one manager of it, and just make sure the operating agreement is written such that the manager of the LLC has voting control of the LLC, and then make sure you're on good terms with that manager. All right, so yeah, we just hit all of that stuff. Some of the other things you can do is you can set, if you're in a good position, you got a really, a really interesting idea and people really are wanting to put money into it, you can put minimum investment requirements so you don't end up with a lot of $1,000 investments. You can put like a 25K, maybe a 50K minimum investment on it. You can do that. There's a lot of angels out there and family offices that can write a pretty good size check and are willing to do it if you're raising enough money that they can see their risk getting distributed a little more broadly. You could also do a thing as a call out that only people who get special investor rights are major investors over some dollar limit. You don't want to have to pass shareholder approvals through everybody who put in $100, but the people who actually have some real skin in the game, that's appropriate. All right. Once you kind of negotiate out the major economic terms, present them with your term sheet. Because if you take their term sheet, they could sneak all kinds of stuff in there that it's going to take you getting with your lawyer to figure out, are they trying to pull something on you? If instead you have your own term sheet, you give it to them, and that forces them to go spend the money. Sometimes these investors will also ask you to pay their legal fees. And there's two things on it. One, make sure it's a reasonable amount, a few $1,000, because it should never cost $25,000 to review a term sheet and an investor rights agreement. It should never cost that. And the second thing is you will never pay it if you don't close on their money. So those are just a couple of things to look at in that terms. Again, sunset all of their board seats at Series A, because you're going to get 1 to 2 VCs at that point on your board. A lot of times they don't like boards going over like 5 people because they want to keep voting concentrated as much as you can. Some people say that you've got to have an odd number of board members. I don't buy that either. What you have to do is you have to manage your board members. If you have something coming up that you want to do, or something that's going to happen and it's going to require board review and approval, you as a CEO needs to go buttonhole every single board member one-on-one, let them know what's going on and take their temperature so that you find out where the board actually stands on stuff. And I've never run into a contentious board. We have, at loggerheads, and somebody's going to be the deciding tiebreaker vote. And it's because usually the CEOs are smart enough to manage the board more so than the board managing the CEO. So let's start taking a look at venture capital. So it's typically in our industry, you're going to see probably Series B, Series C, maybe more. Class 1 device, maybe you get done Series B. That's enough money to get it out there. There was a company that came out of tech. The CEO was Chris Lee. He was on the 40 under 40 at tech, the initial list. It was called Vertera Spine. They made this little polymer spinal implant. And they were able to get that product through the FDA, get it into sales, and get that company acquired with like $7 or $8 million in investor money. That's shocking to me, totally shocking on the low side. So they did an absolutely phenomenal job doing whatever it was that they did. You'll see how much we raised at Proxima in a little bit. All right, so Series A gets you through your testing, your early protos, preclinical studies, and stuff like that. Series B, that's a big nut. That's going to be paying for clinical studies. Or if you don't need to do clinical studies, it's going to be your initial sales effort, building product, putting it on the shelf, and then getting out and selling it, whether it's direct sales or it's out there with distributors. And Series C is going to be really ramping up commercialization on a Class 1, Class 2 device, and it's going to be paying for the pivotal trial for your Class 3 types of medical devices. You may even need a Series D for a PMA type device, because I mean, those things take almost like 150 million bucks to get those things across the finish line. A down round is where the share price on Series B is lower than the share price was on Series A. This is awful. It really hurts the entrepreneur, the founders and the employees. So kind of the moral to that story is, number one, don't push for the highest pre-money value on any round that you possibly can get, because you're ramping up the likelihood you're going to do a down round. And a lot of times you have no control over a down round. There's a lot of problems with companies that are doing Series Cs and later right now not being able to get in any funding, because the economy is just tanked bad enough that we're not seeing acquisitions, we're not seeing IPOs. There's no exit opportunity that the VCs in late stage are seeing. So they're driving the valuations of the companies down because they're running out of money, they're running out of time. So don't be thinking you really got to get the highest pre-money values. That can actually come back to bite you on the ankle really hard. And there's a term for dilution that's used in some of the term sheets. It's called a ratchet, a half ratchet. Watch out for those. If you see anything that sounds like that, it's an anti-dilution paragraph, and that's what can get really, really painful for you guys. This book is probably, bar none, the best book out there. It's written by 2 lawyers that are also VCs. And they actually, in this version of the book, not only do they talk about all these terms and give you actual language, they have an entrepreneur who pipes in with these little, black box opinions in there of the entrepreneur's side of it. Because those 2 guys, they've never done the startup side. They've only done the investor and the attorney side of it. But this is an absolutely phenomenal book to give you the pros and cons of all the terms, which ones are important. There's going to be, in a VC round, the stock purchase agreement is going to be 30 pages long. And there's only going to be like 4 paragraphs that have any real economic or governance value to you. So that's important, that you negotiate over the things that are meaningful and just let the other stuff go. All right, we're getting down to the last part where we're going to start doing a little bit of the cap tables and dilution and what happens here. I'm a UVA grad. I heard you talking about UVA earlier today. So that's where I went to grad school. And this is a beer cap table, by the way. Okay, so so this is what the cap table typically looks like at startup. So you're going to issue 3 million shares, and you're going to split it between the founding CTO and CEO. And in this case, I thought the CTO was more important, so he got more shares than she did. But anyway, this is how it broke up. So 60-40 ownership. That's 100% of stock, and it's got 0 value. All right. Let's say it's exactly like here. You're coming out of here. You did work in your lab, and now you want to license it out of Georgia Tech. The university is going to ask for some percent of the company. I did a license agreement with Case Western Reserve. It took 4 months to negotiate it. Oh my God, was that painful. And it was nonsense. They were getting wrapped around the axle over 10,000, 25,000, 30,000. That's meaningful for us because we have to raise that money. It has no meaning to the university. But typically they'll get 8%. So here's what happens at that point. You issue the 8%, and you can see, guess where it all came from? You. So you're now down from 60% to 55% or 37%. And now we're going to go and prepare for the investors, because the first thing an investor is going to want to do is make sure that when the cash comes in, you have some equity available to incentivize new employees that you're going to hire using their money. So you have to set aside a stock option pool of common stock. And the typical ask is going to be 20%. Push back on that. That's probably too big. And they want this to go before any new money comes in, because the bigger your stock option pool before their money comes in, the better it is for them, the worse it is for you. All right, so here's what it looks like. You now created the stock option pool and everybody took a hit. So you're now down to, as the CTO, you're down to 44%. And even the university took a hit. Look at that. So everybody takes a hit by that thing being there. What you can do with that stock option pool, be careful in early stages, don't do it if you're one of the founders, because you've already got a lot of equity. But later on, you can actually use some of that stock option pool to counter some of the dilution effect that the founders experienced. So you can get some of it possibly back a little later. Don't try to do it yet. They'll look at you as it's a little greedy on your part. So are you hard for 10 to 15% on that stock option pool? That's kind of standard right now, is about 10 to 15%. I think we just did a round and we're looking at, I think it was 11% is what we got agreement on. So that was actually pretty good. So here comes your angel investors, and they're going to pop in here. And in this case, they're going to get 11%. I really squeezed them hard on this example, but they're going to get 11%. Notice that you're now down to 39% as the CTO. You've lost a third of the company. But at this point, the company's starting to actually have some perception of value associated with it. Because once their money is in, you have a pre-money value established, or it's a cap in their case. All right, that all is going to come in on convertible notes. So that 11% and that 500,000 shares is actually going to probably pop up because of the interest that's going to accrue, but it won't be worth worrying about. In this particular example, because the next ones that come in, they're going to be coming in as preferred shares, but we're going to treat it as converted. That's a technical term that just, if everybody's preferred shares converted to common stock, here's what the dilution would be, because it's the only practical way to actually see what happens on a cap table. All right, you drop in Series A, and in this particular case, the VCs are going to get 30%. That's pretty standard, is they're looking for like a 25 to 40%. You will almost never see a single VC take more than 19.99% of a round. And there's an accounting and SEC reason for that, because if somebody owns 20% of a company, they actually have to start reporting it to the Securities and Exchange Commission, and nobody wants to do that. So that's what you're going to see. Nobody would say, you want to raise something that's 30% of your company, we'll take almost 20%. You're going to have to find somebody else to take the rest of it. That's real common, and it's not a problem, by the way. But you can see at this point, the CTO, his ownership's in half. This is okay, though. This is okay. So what happens after you've done 2 more series of rounds? That's where we got started. Here's where we are now. So you got Series B, Series C, and they took, after the Series C, respectively, Series A dropped to 8%, B to 18%. You own 8%. I like the reaction back there. It's like, are you kidding me? Series C is probably the last money this company needs. They're going to get liquid after this. And if you guys executed right, everybody's going to convert to common, and it's going to come out in the wash. This is not like a BS example, just totally made up. When I started Focal Therapeutics, I owned 100% of the company. When we sold it, I owned 9% of the company. We sold it for $125 million. That's real money. So even at small percentages in our space, we're typically getting acquired for 9 figures. you're starting to talk about real money at that point, life-changing types of money at that point. Yep. Now, this one note to make it that when I do most of my companies, I'll invest in the preferred rounds in addition to me just owning a whole bunch of the founders' common stock shares. I'll participate in those rounds. It sends a good message to the investors who are coming in. It sends a good message to all the employees if they know that one of the founders is continuing to put money into it. That's a really reassuring message. So I kind of like seeing that. So this is, I think, actually my last slide. So Proxima Therapeutics, that was the first company that I was involved in. And we raised 50 million in venture capital. We went through 5 different series. Series A was $1 a share. And then we went to $2.40 a share. Then we did a flat round at $2.40 a share. So we didn't do a down round. So we didn't kick in a lot of those anti-dilution things that caused, but between Series B and Series C, do you know what happened? You know what, that was 2001. Guess what happened in 2001? Yeah, the economic landscape got so bad, we were really happy to do a flat round at that point. Then we did $4.80 a share and $7.20 a share. So how does this play out for everybody? We sold it for $200 million to Cytec. This is the type of returns that people did. Again, this took 8 years. So the Series A, you got a 14.2x return, but it took you 8 years to get there. The Series E, they got a 2x in 9 months. Good for them. Good for everybody in the company. That was a nice day for pretty much everybody who was involved in that particular company. So with that, we'll open it up to questions. And I don't know how are we going to, if anybody's got them online, are y'all looking at it? So I guess I'm asking the first question. Go ahead.
In your example, the option pool went up substantially, I think from Series B to C. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. So the question was, for those who might not have heard it, going from Series C, from B to C, the stock option pool as a percentage went way up. Well, as you hire more people, you burn through all those shares that are in the stock option pool that you initially established. And every one of those investors is going to say, you're going to re-up the pool before I put my money in. So it has to keep building back up. And you want it to go up some because you want to, when you give employees stock options, it powerfully aligns their incentives with the companies and with the founders. And this is exactly what you want to do with them. You want them to feel like their individual contributions are really going to bring outsized value for the effort that they put in. And the only way to do that is not with cash compensation. It's going to be with stock options. All that being said, I had 2 employees who worked for me in the exact same position at one point. And one of them said, man, I normally get paid like $220,000 and I'm willing to work for like 150, but I want a nice big equity package. I was like, I dig that. The other person said, I've got all sorts of family responsibilities and I want a salary that's at market and I don't care about the equity. I was like, okay, I know where you're all about safety and security. I wanted that person. I hired them, gave them what they were looking for. They both had what they wanted, what they needed, but I knew in my heart, the second person was not going to be well aligned with what the company did. The first person, he worked 60 hours a week, traveling all over the country, teaching people how to use our products, and he was vastly more productive than the other person. So pay attention. People's incentive structures and what's important to them is really critical to their personal success in your company and to your company's success. So try to keep a lot of those sort of soft skill things in mind, because it's not all about engineering and hardcore finance. It's how to manage people. And this is going to sound terrible, but to extract the maximum amount that you can out of the people that work for you. And if they feel like they're being more than adequately compensated for that, it's amazing what they'll do. Next, any other questions? Yes.
Question about the 8% that the university owns. So my understanding is that if you develop something at a university, they own the patent. So was that 8% referring to the company or?
Yep. So the 8% that the company got in return for licensing, for using entrepreneur licensing the IP. So all of us here at Georgia Tech that are not undergrads, guess who owns your whatever you invent as part of your job here? Georgia Tech. But if you want to commercialize that, Georgia Tech would love for you to do that, but they're going to take a pound of flesh for it. So they typically will take some percentage ownership in the company, and they're going to have a royalty stream associated with it. You can usually negotiate on medical devices in particular. The royalty rate should be sub 10% because you're not pharma. Your gross margins are not pharma style. So you should be looking at 6-7% royalties once you're commercial, and 4 to 8% equity ownership in the company. And they'll never buy another share. They'll never vote anything. They'll just own it and hope that you guys get liquid and they make a bunch of money on it. Because if you do it well, at the time of the liquidity event, their original 8% is probably going to make them more than the cumulative royalties and fees that they charged you up to that point. And the big company can come in and say, all right, we bought the company, you got your equity part paid off. We need to capture all of the revenue and not be giving up that royalty. So they'll buy out the university on the royalty. So the university is like, yeah, great, more money right now. They'll take it. So it's just really interesting to see some of that. There's an organization called VIC Capital, VIC Capital, and they invest in a lot of different healthcare things and stuff out of universities. I think they're out of Ohio or Illinois. They just published on their website a 2-part series for how to negotiate those types of IP licenses. And I read through it and I was like, my God, you actually lived through a big chunk of my experience with Case Western. It was really good. VIC Capital, VIC Capital.
Yeah.
Yeah, 2-part series. You can get it on the web.
Going after SBIR grants and obviously speaking to these like a VC funder is completely differently ball games.
Yep.
For those of us who work with founders that are helping them through that journey, how do you help them make that mental switch from writing grants to knowing how to go after the VC funds?
That's a really good question. So how do you help somebody, a founding team, change their mindset from I'm doing grants to now I'm raising investor money? Well, the thing is, grants will run out. You can't fund a medical device startup or a biotech startup. You can't get enough money into them just from non-dilutive grants. They're not set up that way. So you're going to end up having to augment your management team when you go from the non-dilutive stage, where it's entirely appropriate to have mainly technical people and stuff like that. But you're going to have to get a business and startup focused and experienced CEO at some point who's going to be able to come in, and they're going to bring that mindset with them, and they're going to start changing the culture of the organization to, we're going from non-dilutive grant sort of style things to now we're getting investor money. Those people expect returns. The performance expectation goes up. So yeah, one of the interesting things that I've seen in companies, it's really rare for the startup CEO to take it all the way to liquidity. Really rare. The CEO of Proximo was like the only person that I've personally seen do that. And the reason for that is we have different skill sets at different times. And you'll see a personality change in a product development focused company, meaning pre-FDA clearance, versus when you start, as soon as you hire the first salesperson, their persona is so different than the development team. It's like the introverts versus the extroverts. And when they start getting that, because this is appropriate, because you need to be outward facing. You need to be focused on customers, people buying your product. And it's very hard for the original management team to navigate that change in culture because it is so jarring when that happens. The engineers in the company went from being the stars of the show to, oh, you guys are just telling us what we ought to do now. It's because they're out with customers and the customers are telling them if you make this will be so much more interesting for us. So they immediately come back to product development and tell them, you need to be starting to work on this. And then that's when all the human management side of things starts getting really, really interesting. And that's why you'll start to see transition in leadership at different stages. Like when you go from non-dilutive to investor money, that's one transition. I'm really glad you asked that question, because that's something I hadn't really given a lot of thought to before, but it is kind of like that next transition of going into sales. Lots of questions. Let's start. Yeah.
My first question is, you wouldn't happen to be willing to drop everything for a new CEO role, would you?
So the answer to that question is no. And the reason for that is I've suffered through a lot of operating role type stuff. And I think at this point in my life, I'm much better at maybe offering at least some of my experience that got all this hair gray for you guys. Being in an operating role like CEO is not for the faint of heart. And at this point in time, I'm faint of heart. So second question.
Yeah, so let me get some advice, some of your experience then. Companies, especially from university setting, often the team consists of part-time, mixture of maybe part-time and full-time, because you have the principal investigator who is a professor who's working part-time company and their job. What's the inflection point where, say, a VC says, I don't want anybody who's part-time that's part of this company? Or is there that inflection point?
VCs don't really care. They just want to see that you meet the milestones that you said you were going to meet by, because when you take their money, you're going to have to granularly tell them exactly what you're going to do with it, what things you're going to achieve with it, what milestones you're going to nail with it. And as long as you're doing that, they don't care. So having a part-time CTO that is from the university, from Georgia Tech, they're not going to care as long as you're still putting out a product that's ultimately going to go into sales and start generating the sales ramp, the revenue ramp that you promised them you would do. So I wouldn't worry about that too much. As time goes by, and almost any venture capitalist will tell you this, they are not betting on the technology. They're betting on the people running the company. And because of that, they don't really care. Those people just better be able to hire really sharp execution style, people that can execute on their duties. And that's why they look for people with experience. You may get a Series A round done with your initial sort of startup CEO, but they may also tell you that now that the money's in, you're going to hire somebody. A lot of times they have somebody that's an entrepreneur in residence in their venture capital firm that's exited before, and they'll want to install that person. So this is actually a good question to ask. If they start indicating, we want you to hire a new CEO or a new management team, then you say, do you have somebody in particular in mind? Or can we, go look for somebody that we think's the best fit? Because there's going to be a lot of dynamic friction between the two, and everybody likes dealing with known quantities, known people that, so you don't know their former CEO, but they probably made them a lot of money, but they may be a total jackass.
Speak a little bit about anti-dilution provisions, like when they would make sense for who in the cap table, how they kind of work.
Anti-dilution provisions make they are awful for everybody on the cap table except the investor who required it, because that's the one it's going to protect. Everybody who's downstream from there, like if it's Series C asked for it, Series B, A, and the common stockholders, they're the ones who get hosed, because they're going to get, the Series C is going to get extra shares to compensate for whatever happened that triggered the anti-dilution principle, and nobody else is going to get it. So nobody else other than that round of investors is going to benefit from it. You typically only see those things come in if you have a very voracious, rapacious investor and the economy is really, really bad, or they're looking ahead to the next 2 years and going, things look super bad. You need my money so bad. You're on vapors. You're going to run out of cash in 3 months. If you don't take my money, I'm going to give you the worst terms I can possibly shove down your throat. That's what they do.
So I ask partially because I've seen universities asking for these sometimes in founding licenses to companies. And I just can't imagine that any follow-on investors would be good with that. I don't know if they've ever been successful in getting this. Just curious if you've
No.
seen that.
This actually brings up a really good counter argument. I would never give a university any dilution principle. They're going to ask for it. They're going to ask for the sun, moon, and the stars, and you just don't give it to them. But because at the end of the day, if you walk away from that, they get nothing. So what you do is you say, and I use this with Case Western on some other things. I say, if you force me to take this, you're going to devalue this company when we go post revenue. They wanted like a really extreme, like 15% royalty. And I said, if you do that, nobody's going to want to buy this thing because the earnings per share hit is going to happen to it. You're effectively going to make it harder for me to raise money and get liquid by requiring that right now. And that's the way you kind of counter back a lot of these things is if you really want it, you're shooting yourself in the foot with it. Probably the biggest thing is to go talk to somebody who's done this before and successfully navigated that process, and they can tell you where the potholes are that aren't obvious. Yeah.
Two thoughts. One on that, the anti-dilution piece, I've always thought a good argument would be like, hey, you're an investor now. You have an obligation to help build value in this company as well, right? So why should you benefit unilaterally when we don't, or the market circumstances don't help? You could try that. But more importantly, my question is, if I'm lucky enough as a life science entrepreneur to get to an A or a B round, how can I understand what valuation considerations should be from the investors? Like, I'm just going through tests. I'm still scientifically oriented. Like, how do I know what's a fair value?
Part of it is you have to look at precedent. What else is being, this is always a really strong thing that you can do with investors is when you're trying to negotiate either economic terms or governance terms, anything that's really important, if you can point to other examples that support your position, then they're going to have a hard time arguing against it. So always try to point to a real example of something that's supporting your argument. They may have all sorts of other things that they can say, no, this is what we just did, this, and this. It's like, that's okay. But when we look through, the pitch book data, or we pull SEC data and we take a look at other teams that we've seen and read about, this is the median case. We believe we're actually better than median. We all believe that, right? So you can use that kind of thing to argue against them. Most investors, they're not all that sensitive to the pre-money value. They are a little bit. There was a recent example I was aware of where a term sheet was dropped on a company, and it had, I think it was 20 million at an 80 million pre-money value. 2 weeks later, they had another term sheet for 35 million at 115 million. Did anything happen in 2 weeks to that company to change? Hell no, nothing. But somebody thought it was worth more. So all of a sudden you take the first term sheet and you go back to the first one. You want to play in this sandbox, or should we just send Christmas cards to each other from this point forward? And those people got on board with the second one, which that really kind of surprised me, because that just said that the first ones was just total lowball on it. And if you don't have some precedent, PitchBook is one place where you can get that, because they'll break it down by the bottom quartile, the median, and the top quartile. And that at least lets you know how things are working out. Don't use averages. You need to use medians, because when you use averages, they get skewed by the unicorns, and you get like $10 billion, evaluation, and everybody else is at 8 or 9 million. And then you look at the average and go, well, we ought to be worth like 200 million. Now you're probably worth more like the median to the 75th percentile. Yes. Let's see. I'm going to have to take that down to see. Yep, now we're live. Okay. You mentioned about the university taking equity in the new company, but also isn't just doing a royalty, also common practice? Yep. They're going to ask for, here's sort of the laundry list, and this is not all encompassing. They're going to ask for a signing fee. They're going to ask for quarterly minimums. They're going to ask for things like, we want $250,000 when you get FDA clearance, or they want $500,000 for the first patient treated with these things. And then once you start selling, they're going to want some royalty rate. And when your royalty rate gets up above some level that's equivalent to those monthly or quarterly minimums, then the quarterly minimums go away, and then you're just on the hook for those. That's what they'll ask for. Negotiate. Are you back with them? You don't have to take what they're proposing, because most of the universities, you know, there's actually a professional society for Office of Technology transfer people. Just like cardiology, they got their own bloody meeting and they go to, and they sit, and the person that they have as the guest, the keynote speaker, is the one that did the biggest damn deal that year. And so everybody says, he did it, I'm going to do it. And the next thing you know, everybody's trying to force really bad terms on everybody. But that's not how these things actually get done. The interesting thing I found, I was trying to negotiate a royalty, a licensing deal with Dow Chemical in one of the first company I was in. Dow is a public company. I found a licensing agreement in the Edgar database. It was included in one of their quarterly annual reports, the whole thing. It was like 40 pages long. They redacted a few things in it, but I saw exactly what their standard terms were that they were using. And when they came in and said, here's what we want, I said, well, no, here's what we're willing to do. And it was very reflective of what I saw that they had done before. They didn't have a leg to stand on. Now, they held some cards because we really wanted their IP. But at the end of the day, you know, it's in everybody's best interest to get something closed, so everybody benefits from it. And you just got to find that sweet spot that everybody actually does feel like they've gotten a positive deal out of it. Anytime you try to maximize your leverage and really crush the other person, it's just not good. It's not nice, and it's not effective either. Any other questions? I'm gonna try to type in, see if I can type something in here. Well, where is it? Oh, it's right there, right? All right, this is my email. And again, this is something I did not realize when I was a lot younger. Entrepreneurs, they're just like you. They want to help you out. Unless you're just dead on competing with them, they'll usually bend over backwards to answer your questions, spend time with you and stuff like that, because you're part of the club. And what you're doing is really, really hard. And they recognize that, and they want to help you guys out. So, any other questions? If not, I really enjoyed it. This was a lot of fun with y'all. So glad to be back live.